All right, so we are now recording, and I'm gonna move this up and down. Okay, so we're pretty close. And so this video is not like a formal anything. I'm just kind of diving into something that I've been thinking about. For the most part, I kind of have watched a lot of interesting stuff on the internet, heard a lot of interesting ideas, and then I've kind of had some ideas myself, and now we have the ability to access AI. So it's kind of easier to check into some of those ideas. And that's what I've done. So this idea that it's not a new idea, maybe just the perspective is new, or just I'm seeing it from my perspective finally, and it makes sense to me. So I'm like, hey. Anyways, so the idea is like a conscious holograph. So these are just principles. Like, we know what words are, like a holograph. Everyone kind of has their own understanding of what that is. And then like consciousness, everyone kind of has their own understanding of what that is, you know, inside your head when you're thinking. Like, you're kind of aware of that. Is that consciousness, or is like the thing that's aware of that voice, is that consciousness, you know? So it's just it's a pretty deep rabbit hole to dive down, and it's very interesting. So this is diving into like a connection, a potential connection between consciousness and like a holographic concept, you know, of how they could kind of be connected. So anyways, basically I've got the iPad screen recording, and then so I plan on putting that up somewhere and kind of going through this as I talk about it. So I'm gonna read what I see here, so I'm gonna be looking down. Anyways, you'll get the point. So what I did is I had some transcripts that were going into how holography works, and then I had transcripts that were going into quantum mechanics and essentially how photons of light travel all paths, but then they kind of like settle in on the one that's of least action. So we'll get into that, but that's kind of the idea. So two domains, holography and Feynman's path, integral least action picture. So the holography and then the Feynman's path, that's kind of the path of least action. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on any of this. I just essentially had observed these things, and then I was like, oh, those are kind of interesting connections, and I've been feeding it with AI and then just kind of independent research, and everything kind of seems interesting. So anyways, as we can see here, map onto my idea of belief aligning with the object beam so that the true image or true intention can appear without distortion. So that's the idea that our conscious awareness and belief in that, or you know, whatever, can kind of create our perception of like the hologram that we're seeing. So let's kind of dive into this. So there are 4 points here. The first one is holography in belief. Object beam plus reference beam equals the complete wavefront. So let's go ahead and kind of expand that out. And I'm basically just going to kind of read this. It might be kind of dry, but it's really interesting. So, recording stage, the interference pattern. A coherent laser beam is split into two paths. One path, the object beam, illuminates your three-dimensional scene. The other, the reference beam, bypasses the scene and reaches the photographic film directly. So those are two beams. Wherever object beam and reference beam meet on the film, they interfere. Because both beams have the same frequency, That interference pattern encodes not just intensity, but also the local phase of the object beam relative to the reference beam at any or at every point on the film. Okay? The upshot is that you end up with a two-dimensional fringe map, an interference pattern, whose microscopic variations contain the full three-dimensional information about where objects were, how they bent or reflected light, etc. Okay, so it's very interesting. Continuing on. Reconstruction stage, recreating the object wavefront. To view the hologram, you block the original object and shine only the same reference beam back through the developed film. At each tiny region of the film, that fringe pattern now behaves like a diffraction grating. One of the diffracted orders matches exactly the way the original object beam would have left that point if the object beam were still there. Wow. In effect, the film re-releases a copy of the original object beam, complete with all its directional phase information, so your eye perceives a three-dimensional floating image behind the film, even though nothing physical is there. Just continuing on. Sensitivity to alignment. If the object beam and reference beam weren't perfectly coherent, the same wavelength, well-controlled phase relations, or if the film optics shifted by more than a fraction of a wavelength, the interference pattern would blur and the reconstructed image would distort or vanish. In practical terms, alignment means adjusting beam angles, path length differences, and optical stability so that when the reference beam retraces its original path through the film, it neatly overlaps in phase with what the object beam would have been, thereby yielding a crisp 3D image. So, how I understand this is just, it's indicating that the reference beam needs to align with the object beam to accurately recreate like what was captured. Okay, so we're just continuing on. That's section 1. So next is Feynman's path integral picture. So this is all possible trajectories. And then least action dominates. So this is saying that photons will essentially travel all paths and then they settle on one of least action. So every photon explores every path. In Feynman's formulation, whenever a photon or any quantum particle goes from point A to point B, you must sum the contribution from every conceivable path, including wildly bent or even superluminal trajectories. Mathematically, each path contributes a complex amplitude. And then there's some mathematical equations diving into action. And trajectory being S being path. I am not a scientist. So, continuing on. Part 2 of section 2. Phase oscillation and destructive interference. Because S, the path, changes rapidly, I think that's path, because S changes rapidly for paths that deviate significantly from the classical least action route, those wildly varying phases tend to cancel one another out when you add them all up. Only the paths near the stationary least action point have phases that stay nearly in step, so their contributions add constructively. I would try to explain it, but that literally explained it. The end result, although in principle the photon visits or samples all paths, you effectively only see the classical path of least action, because all other contributions annihilate one another by destructive interference. That's wild. Part 3. Why least action emerges naturally. When the classical action S is large compared to any small change in the, compared to, I don't know what that is, to be honest. H bar, any small change in the path yields a huge phase shift. Only at or near stationary least action path does these variables stay nearly in phase. To be honest, this sentence, it's hard to read, kind of, because does delta S remain negligible under small variations? So I think that's the path of least action. So then it says, hence, those are the only contributions that survive in the sum. So that it does make sense. So it's like, it's just like water flowing down like a hill or something. It might try to go one way, but water will just find the easiest path. So it's not a direct analogy, but it's kind of what this is kind of saying. It's how I see it anyways. All right, so continuing on. This is dense here, but it's so interesting. I've wanted to make this video for a long time. Or I wanted to start making videos on this for a long time. Okay, so anyways, now this is section 3. Drawing the analogy, belief as reference beam. That's right. Object as true image. So that's the reference beam is going to be belief, and the object beam is going to be the true image. And then there's selective interference. All right, so belief, alignment, reference beam, coherence. In holography, a crisp hologram demands that the reference beam be precisely phased in relation to the object beam. If the reference beam drifts out of phase, even by a fraction of a wavelength, the reconstructed image becomes blurred or distorted. Metaphorically, think of belief or intention as your reference beam. Unless your belief is perfectly coherent with the deeper object, the true form or purpose you wish to manifest, your perceived reality, the holographic reconstruction, will come out warped or partial. On to number 2. True original, object wave. Authentic source or deeper truth. The object beam contains all the genuine, three-dimensional information about what's actually there. Its shape, position, refractive effects, etc. Likewise, your true original might be an unfiltered ideal or authentic alignment you're aiming to realize. Perhaps a particular spiritual state, creative output, or inner truth. Man, that is so wild. Okay, so continuing on, part 3. Interference pattern, combined grid of belief plus reality. When you record a hologram, the film stores the sum of reference plus object wave as an interference pattern. That stored pattern only makes sense or reconstructs a real 3D object if you later re-illuminate with exactly the same reference wave. In my analogy, the mind's mental grid or schema, how you habitually think, the layers of biases, is like that stored interference pattern. If your belief system, the reference beam, has been precisely tuned to match your deeper object, true intention, then viewing your everyday reality through that belief filter yields a clear, undistorted manifestation of what you intended. If not, the world you see becomes fuzzy, missing detail, or even fundamentally misaligned. Part 4, Photon Path Integral, exploring all belief trajectories, selecting least action belief. In the quantum picture, every possible trajectory or path of a photon must be considered, but only those paths near the least action trajectory remain in phase and manifest physically. Similarly, imagine that your mind or psyche runs through a multitude of possible belief trajectories at every moment, every way you could interpret or engage with reality. Most of these interpretations / trajectories generate conflicting or out of phase mental results, so they cancel each other out in your experience. You don't actually live them. The beliefs that stay in phase are those that minimize inner friction. The path of least action, or the path of least internal resonance, or least psychic action, these dominate how you actually perceive and co-create your lived reality. Part 5, reconstruction, aligning belief, reference beam, subconscious cues, interference, to let the true image appear. When you place the correctly aligned reference beam back through the hologram, you recover the complete object wave. In life, when your conscious belief system is perfectly in resonance with your deeper intention, analogous to the original object beam, then simply by shining that belief or reference beam on your mental / interference pattern substrate, the full true image, the authentic potential, manifests as experience. In other words, just as misalignment of optical beams produce a blurred hologram, any tiny misalignment between what you believe and what is actually true, intentional, yields a distorted or partial lived result. Only when you fine-tune those beliefs phase so they actually match your deeper purpose object does the complete image reconstruct perfectly. I mean, that's stinking wild, man. That is stinking wild. Okay, so that was section 3. Let's head to section 4, which is putting it all together. So let's see what we've got. Holography teaches that phase coherence between reference plus object is the essential secret ingredient for faithfully capturing and later reproducing a multi-dimensional reality, the 3D scene. If phase drifts, you lose fidelity. Quantum path integrals teach that all possible paths exist in principle, but only those that satisfy the stationary action condition interference constructively produce anything real. Every other path self-destructs through destructive interference. My analogy suggests let your belief system, reference beam, become perfectly coherent with your authentic intention, object beam. In doing so, your mind's interference pattern, built from countless competing mental emotional trajectories, will self-cancel anything that isn't aligned with that core intention. What remains is constructive interference is the clear. What remains in constructive interference is the clear, undistorted, true image of what you intend to manifest. In essence, just as a hologram uses perfect beam alignment to recreate the true original rather than a distorted ghost, your belief, when perfectly tuned, serves as the reference beam that filters out every confused, noisy mental trajectory, leaving only that which is aligned with the least action path of your soul's intention. When that happens, your lived reality is the full, undistorted reflection of, it says your deepest object beam, but I would say of the deepest object beam. There's a reflective question from the AI. We'll see what that says here. If you imagine your daily thoughts and choices as the countless photon paths in Feynman's integral, is there a way in your practice to notice which beliefs are drifting out of phase, accumulating disruptive action, so they naturally cancel out? And conversely, how might you intentionally tune a core belief so that it stays in phase with your deepest purpose, thereby letting the true image of your vision reconstruct itself in your life? I don't have the answers to that reflective question, but anyways, that I feel is a really good expression of what I was kind of thinking about. Now, I don't think that this is a whole picture here, and I've got so much more to dive into regarding this. I've got like so much stuff in this, but I think that was a really good just kind of introduction and overview of what I was thinking. I don't necessarily think that that's maybe even a totally new thought or anything like that, but there's just a whole lot of scientific stuff that keeps on coming out that it's just like, it really makes you kind of reconsider strongly these things here. So yeah, I'm kind of curious to see if anyone watches this and see what they think about it. But that's really wild. So I don't know, just kind of off the top of my head of where I am right now, I don't know if there's like an like God's object beam, or what the original beam is, and if it's like we need to align with that, or you just need to not have the internal conflict. I'm not sure, but everything kind of says that there might be something here. So I think we should look at it.